The sequence, left behind by the earlier discussion, does not resolve into silence. Instead, it moves into a zone where the tablets themselves appear to hesitate, as if the act of recording has begun to feel different to the scribes who impressed the signs. The change is not announced. It does not arrive with a declaration or a new genre. It emerges quietly, in the way lines are ordered, in how names are introduced, and in the small formulas that frame what follows. In the earliest administrative texts, before the Anunnaki occupy a sustained place in written focus, the tablets tend to present their information with a steady uniformity. Accounts open with quantities, lists with categories, and colophons with brief statements of custody or completion. The language remains practical and restrained, shaped by the needs of storage and recall. When divine names appear, they do so as reference points rather than agents, markers of institutional ownership rather than narrative centers. The records behave as if their primary task is preservation rather than explanation. As the Anunnaki begin to enter the written record more consistently, the surface of the tablets remains familiar, but their internal organization starts to shift. Lists that once moved directly from item to item begin to pause on names, setting them apart with determinatives or altered ordering. In lexical texts, the sequence of terms subtly changes, placing divine designations earlier, sometimes before geographic or material categories that previously held priority. This reordering does not interrupt the administrative function of the lists, yet it reframes how the information is meant to be read. Colophons provide another quiet signal. Earlier examples often limit themselves to identifying the scribe, the tablet's location, or the institution responsible for its keeping. In later texts, brief invocations or acknowledgments appear with greater regularity, not as prayers, but as markers of authority. The presence of the Anunnaki is not elaborated upon, but it is named as part of the framework within which the record exists. The act of writing is no longer presented as solely human labor. It is situated within a broader order that includes divine oversight. The tone of certain formulaic openings also changes. Where earlier tablets begin abruptly, later ones sometimes introduce their content with phrases that situate the record within an established order. These formulas do not narrate events. They orient the tablet in relation to a pre-existing structure of legitimacy. The Anunnaki are not described as arriving or acting within these texts. Instead, they are treated as already present, already embedded in the administrative world that the tablet reflects. This suggests that the scribes were not recording a new story so much as adjusting how memory itself was framed. The records continue to catalog goods, labor, and land, but the language implies that these elements are now understood as parts of a system whose origins lie beyond the immediate human sphere. The shift is subtle enough that it can be overlooked, yet consistent enough to indicate a change in how authority was conceptualized. Textual criticism highlights another layer in the arrangement of lists. In god lists and temple inventories, the relative placement of names stabilizes in new patterns. The Anunnaki appear within clusters rather than in isolation, positioned among other divine figures in ways that suggest hierarchy and function. The ordering is not random. It follows conventions that align with institutional practice, implying that these names had become integrated into the bureaucratic memory of the temples themselves. What is striking is the absence of explanation. The tablets do not pause to clarify who the Anunnaki are or why they matter. Their significance is assumed. This absence suggests that, by the time these texts were written, the presence of the Anunnaki had already been normalized within scribal culture. The records behave as though the audience understands the framework in which these names operate, even if modern readers must reconstruct it through inference. The shift can also be seen in how responsibility is distributed within the texts. Earlier records emphasize human officials, overseers, and institutions. Later ones begin to balance this emphasis with references to divine allocation or sanction. The Anunnaki are not depicted as intervening, but as anchoring the system in which decisions are made. Authority becomes layered, extending upward without displacing the administrative machinery below. These changes imply that the scribes were responding to more than theological development. They appear to be adjusting the grammar of record-keeping itself. The tablets continued to function as tools of memory, yet the memory they preserve is now oriented toward a deeper past, one that does not need to be narrated because it is treated as foundational. The Anunnaki enter the text not as characters, but as structural elements of the world the scribes inhabit. Such shifts invite careful restraint in interpretation. The records do not announce a transformation, and they do not frame it as innovation. They suggest continuity, but a continuity that has absorbed a new layer of meaning. The Anunnaki are written as though they have always belonged to the order being recorded, even when their textual prominence increases. If the tablets begin to speak differently at this point, it is not because they have discovered something new, but because they are remembering something in a different way. The question that follows is not when the Anunnaki arrived in narrative terms, but when and why the scribes began to treat their presence as an essential part of how records themselves were structured and what earlier assumptions made that shift necessary. The movement from the earlier shift in record structure does not immediately lead to an abundance of names. Instead, the tablets linger in a space where roles appear before identities, where function precedes personhood. The language suggests that whatever was being integrated into the scribal world was first understood through what it did, not what it was called. In several early administrative and lexical contexts, terms associated with authority, measurement, and allocation emerge without clear attachment to individual divine names. Words denoting judgment, boundary setting, weighing, and assignment appear embedded in procedural phrases. These terms are not poetic. They belong to the vocabulary of work, of regulation, of order maintenance. The tablets treat these functions as necessary operations within the system, not as acts performed by dramatized beings. Linguistic analysis shows that some of the earliest references later associated with the Anunnaki occupy grammatical positions closer to offices. They appear alongside titles and roles, already familiar from human administration. The language does not distinguish sharply between divine and institutional function. Instead, it places these roles within a continuum of authority that moves from the human to the superhuman without a clear dividing line. In certain lexical lists, verbs related to measuring land, assigning labor, or determining fate are grouped with abstract nouns rather than with named agents. This grouping suggests that the scribes were cataloging operations essential to the functioning of the world as they understood it. Only later do these operations become consistently linked to specific divine designations. The progression implies a conceptual order in which function is primary and naming is secondary. The absence of narrative framing reinforces this impression. There is no account of beings arriving to take on these roles. Instead, the roles themselves seem to demand a locus of authority beyond ordinary human officials. The Anunnaki, when they begin to be named, appear to fill a pre-existing conceptual space. They do not introduce new functions. They stabilize ones already present in the administrative imagination. This role-based entry can also be seen in how responsibility is linguistically assigned. Early phrases often use passive or impersonal constructions, indicating that actions occur according to established order rather than individual will. When divine references appear, they do so as guarantors of process rather than initiators of change. The language suggests that the system operates because it is aligned with an overarching structure, not because specific beings intervene. Such patterns imply that the scribes were less concerned with mythic origin than with operational coherence. Their priority was to ensure that records reflected a world that made sense administratively. If divine figures were introduced, they were introduced as necessary anchors for functions that could not be fully grounded in human authority alone. Naming follows necessity, not imagination. Over time, the tablets begin to associate these functions more explicitly with the Anunnaki. Titles harden into names, and roles become attributes. Yet even then, the impetus remains on what is done rather than who does it. The Anunnaki are rarely described acting independently. They are referenced as part of a collective responsible for maintaining order. This collective framing further distances them from individualized mythic figures. The linguistic evidence suggests a gradual crystallization rather than a sudden invention. The scribes appeared to inherit a conceptual framework in which certain functions require superhuman legitimacy. The Anunnaki emerged within this framework as the named holders of those functions, not as newly imagined entities. The process feels administrative, almost bureaucratic, rather than creative. This approach aligns with a broader pattern in the tablets, where stability is valued over explanation. The records do not seek to justify why these functions exist or why they are associated with divine authority. They assume acceptance. The language implies that the audience, whether contemporary officials or future readers, already understands the necessity of such roles. If the Anunnaki entered the written record first as functions and only later as names, It raises a quiet but persistent question. Were the scribes preserving a memory of roles that predated their labels? And if so, what earlier structure required such functions to exist before they could ever be personified? The emphasis on function before name does not remain confined to the divine sphere. It quietly extends into how political authority is framed, especially in the language surrounding kingship. When the Anunnaki enter written focus, the tablets do not respond by inventing kingship anew. Instead, they begin to speak of rule as something held, managed, and answerable, rather than something generated at the moment of accession. Earlier royal inscriptions and administrative texts already acknowledged kings as central figures, yet their authority is often expressed in direct, almost unexamined terms. The king builds, the king commands, the king These actions are recorded as facts of governance, requiring little justification beyond their execution. As divine frameworks become more explicit in the record, the language surrounding these same actions subtly shifts. The king continues to act, but the texts increasingly situate those actions within a delegated order. Terms associated with stewardship appear with greater regularity. The king is described as holding office on behalf of a higher structure, maintaining balance rather than asserting origin. This does not reduce royal authority. It reframes Italiano. Kingship is presented as a responsibility embedded within a larger system of order that the Anunnaki are treated as overseeing. The implication is not that kings rule because the gods created them, but that they rule because they are entrusted with a role. Administrative records reinforce this framing. In land grants, labor assignments, and temple accounts, the king's decisions are increasingly aligned with phrases that suggest accountability. The language implies that outcomes are measured against established standards rather than personal will. The Anunnaki appear in this context not as patrons of individual kings, but as reference points for the order that kings are expected to uphold. This shift is particularly visible in how failure and disorder are addressed. Earlier texts tend to record disruption as a practical problem to be corrected. Later ones begin to frame mismanagement as deviation from an inherited structure. The king is still responsible for restoration, but the standard of correction lies beyond him. The Anunnaki function here as guarantors of continuity, not as originators of royal power. The absence of coronation narratives centered on divine creation is notable. The tablets do not dwell on moments when kings are made by the gods. Instead, they focus on ongoing performance, maintaining temples, ensuring proper measures, preserving boundaries. Kingship appears as an office that must be continually justified through alignment with an existing order. The Anunnaki's presence strengthens this expectation rather than replacing it with mythic elevation. Political language also becomes more collective. The king is described alongside assemblies, councils, and institutional bodies. Divine authority does not isolate him. It situates him within a network of responsibilities. The Anunnaki are invoked as part of that network, reinforcing the idea that rule is distributed and supervised rather than absolute. This collective framing suggests an inherited political philosophy in which stability depends on cooperation between human and superhuman levels of administration. Such patterns imply that kingship was understood as ancient even to the scribes recording it. The Anunnaki do not denigrate rule. They contextualize it. Their appearance in royal language serves to anchor kingship in a deeper past, one that the tablets treat as already established. The king becomes a caretaker of something older than his reign, and possibly older than the institutions he commands. This reframing aligns with the broader documentary character of the texts. They are less concerned with legitimizing power through spectacle than with documenting its proper exercise. Kingship is preserved in writing as a function that must conform to inherited standards. The Anunnaki are part of those standards, not as mythic founders, but as enduring points of accountability. If the language of rule changes in this way after the Anunnaki enter the record, it suggests a political memory being clarified rather than a system being invented. The question that follows is whether this reframing reflects a response to real historical pressures on kingship, or whether it preserves an older conception of authority that only later required explicit articulation. The reframing of kingship does not culminate in clarification. Instead, it leads into a body of material that is striking for what it withholds. Among the thousands of administrative tablets produced in Sumerian cities, many quietly assume divine authority without ever explaining it. These documents do not argue, justify, or narrate. They operate ration lists, delivery receipts, labor rosters, and temple inventories often contain indirect references to divine domains, estates, or standards. A field belongs to a god. A workforce is assigned to a temple. A measure is calibrated according to a sacred norm. Yet nowhere in these operational texts is there an attempt to explain why divine authority underlies these arrangements. The tablets behave as if explanation would be redundant. From an archaeological perspective, this silence is significant. These are not literary compositions aimed at broad audiences. They are tools of administration created for immediate use and future verification. Their primary concern is accuracy, continuity, and accountability. The presence of divine reference functions as part of the administrative environment, not as a subject requiring elaboration. In many cases, divine oversight appears only as a boundary condition. The tablet records what was issued, received, or measured within a framework already assumed to be legitimate. The gods are not actors within the transaction. They are the horizon within which the transaction makes sense. This indirect presence suggests that divine authority was treated as infrastructural rather than performative. The avoidance of narrative is especially notable, given the opportunity these tablets present. Scribes had space, skill, and precedent for explanation. In other genres, they could and did elaborate on origins, conflicts, and divine actions. The choice not to do so here reflects a disciplinary boundary within scribal practice. Administrative texts were not the place where meaning was constructed. They were where meaning was applied. This separation implies a high degree of institutional confidence. The scribes did not need to persuade their readers of divine legitimacy. They assumed shared understanding. The Anunnaki, when implicated, are never introduced or defined. Their authority is embedded in the structure of the document itself, and how ownership is assigned and responsibility distributed. The tablets also reveal a careful economy of language. Every sign carries weight. Extraneous explanation would undermine the efficiency of the record. By excluding narrative, the scribes preserve the tablet's function as a stable unit of memory. Divine authority becomes part of the background architecture, supporting the record without intruding upon it. Administrative archaeology shows that this pattern persists across locations and periods. Even as divine frameworks become more explicit elsewhere, operational documents remain restrained. This consistency suggests that the avoidance of explanation was not oversight, but convention. The scribes knew where explanation belonged, and it was not here. Such restraint also hints at the longevity of the assumptions involved. Systems that require constant explanation are often new or contested. Systems treated as self-evident are usually inherited. The tablets imply that divine oversight, including that associated with the Anunnaki, was already old by the time these documents were written. Its origins lay beyond the scope of daily record-keeping. The result is a corpus of texts that speaks through omission. By refusing to explain, the tablets assert continuity. They preserve a world in which divine authority does not need to announce itself, because it is already woven into the processes of allocation, measurement, and control. The scribes record outcomes, not origins. This raises a subtle but persistent implication. If the administrative tablets do not explain divine authority because it is assumed, then where was that authority first articulated? And at what point did explanation become unnecessary enough to be excluded from the very documents that depended upon it? The administrative silence of the tablets finds its physical counterpart in the buildings where many of those tablets were stored. When attention shifts from text to architecture, the temples that dominate Sumerian cities do not present themselves primarily as places of spectacle or ritual performance. They present themselves as managed spaces, controlled, segmented, and oriented toward work. Archaeological plans from cities such as Uruk and Eridu show temple complexes organized around courtyards, storerooms, and restricted interiors rather than open congregational halls. Movement through these structures was channeled, access narrowed as one proceeded inward. This pattern does not suggest an emphasis on gathering or communal display. It suggests oversight, regulation, and control. Storage rooms occupy a disproportionate amount of space within these complexes. Archaeological evidence points to large quantities of grain, textiles, and tools being housed within temple precincts. These were not symbolic offerings left untouched. They were counted, redistributed, and recorded. The presence of standardized containers and seal impressions indicates that goods moved through these spaces under supervision, following procedures consistent with administrative management. The architectural emphasis on storage aligns closely with the bureaucratic tablets associated with these sites. Many of the texts record inflows and outflows of resources, tied directly to temple estates. The building and the tablet reinforce one another. The temple functions as an office where resources are aggregated and reassessed, not merely as a sacred focal point where they are consumed in ritual. Access control further supports this interpretation. Doorways narrow, thresholds rise, and internal rooms become increasingly secluded. Such features limit who can enter and under what conditions. This kind of design is unnecessary for open ritual performance, but essential for safeguarding assets and regulating labor. The temple becomes a space where authority is enacted quietly, through control of movement rather than through display. The placement of scribal rooms, within or adjacent to temple complexes, strengthens this picture. Writing desks, clay storage areas, and discarded tablets are often found in proximity to storerooms. This spatial relationship suggests that record-keeping was integrated into the daily operation of the temple. The act of writing was part of managing resources, not a separate scholarly pursuit. Divine presence within these buildings is implied rather than dramatized. Altars and cultic installations exist, but they do not dominate the layout. Instead, they coexist with workspaces. The architecture does not privilege ritual over administration. It accommodates both, with a clear emphasis on sustained operation. The gods are housed within systems that function continuously, not intermittently. After the Anunnaki become more explicit in textual frameworks, this architectural logic does not change abruptly. Rather, it appears to intensify. Temple estates expand, storage capacity increases, and administrative complexity grows. The divine order that the Anunnaki represent is not expressed through new ritual spaces but through expanded infrastructure. The gods are present as overseers of process, not as recipients of spectacle. This suggests that temples were understood as institutional bodies. They managed land, labor, and production over long periods. The architecture reflects continuity rather than innovation. The Anunnaki do not transform temples into offices. They clarify why these offices exist within a divine framework that legitimizes their authority. The builders who laid out these complexes were not designing symbolic monuments alone. They were constructing environments optimized for control, accountability, and preservation. The temple stands as a physical archive, storing both material goods and the assumptions that govern their movement. If temples increasingly functioned as offices embedded within divine order rather than as shrines defined by ritual display, then the question that follows is whether the sacred in Sumer was ever meant to be separated from administration at all, or whether divine authority was always intended to reside precisely where records were kept and resources were controlled. The administrative logic embedded in temples and tablets continues into the legal language of Sumer, where order is articulated not through narrative origin, but through formula. When legal texts invoke the Anunnaki, they do so with restraint, positioning them not as lawmakers, but as witnesses and guarantors of an order already assumed to exist. Early legal compilations, including those associated with your present judgments and penalties in measured, procedural terms. The laws enumerate situations, outcomes, and compensations without extended justification. When divine authority is referenced, it is not framed as the source of the law's content. Instead, the Anunnaki appear at the margins of the text, embedded within oath formulas or concluding affirmations that anchor the law's validity beyond the human court. Oaths provide the clearest linguistic evidence. In contractual tablets and dispute records, parties swear not to invent the rule they are obeying, but to uphold what is already established. The Anunnaki are invoked alongside other divine collectives as those before whom the oath is binding. The language does not suggest that these beings authored the agreement. It suggests that they oversee its faithful execution. This distinction matters. Legal language separates creation from enforcement. The scribes do not portray the Anunnaki as issuing laws anew. They frame them as ensuring continuity, as stabilizing forces that render agreements durable across time and circumstance. The law operates because it is embedded in an order that transcends individual rulers and jurisdictional formulas reinforce this view. Tablets recording verdicts often specify that decisions are made according to the established word or, as is fitting, phrases that imply precedent rather than revelation. When divine reference appears, it underscores the seriousness of deviation, not the novelty of the rule. The Anunnaki are positioned as guarantors of consequence rather than architects of principle. Spatial context deepens the picture. Many legal tablets originate from temple-adjacent archives in cities such as Nippur, where religious and administrative functions intersect. The proximity of legal activity to sacred precincts does not result in theological elaboration within the texts. Instead, it normalizes divine oversight as part of the institutional environment. Law is practiced under watch, not under instruction. The language of penalties further suggests inherited order. Sanctions are calibrated, proportional, and standardized. They presuppose a shared understanding of justice that requires no mythic explanation. Anunnaki's presence in these texts signals accountability beyond the immediate court, extending responsibility into a moral and cosmic register without redefining the law itself. Even in cases involving boundary disputes or property claims tied to temple estates, divine authority functions as a stabilizer. The gods, including the Anunnaki, are invoked to affirm boundaries, not to redraw them. The implication is that order predates the dispute and will outlast it. The law serves to restore alignment, not to innovate norms. This juridical framing aligns with the broader documentary character of Sumerian writing. The scribes were not composing treatises on justice. They were recording decisions meant to endure. By placing the Anunnaki at the level of guarantee, they situate the law within a continuum of memory, one that extends backward beyond any single reign and forward beyond the present case. The restraint of legal language mirrors the restraint seen in administrative texts. Explanation is unnecessary because legitimacy is assumed. The Anunnaki are not dramatized. They are referenced. Their authority is quiet, structural, and persistent. Law is treated as something received and maintained, not announced or invented. If the Anunnaki appear in legal formulas primarily as witnesses to order rather than as its creators, the question that follows is whether Sumerian law was understood as human articulation of an older structure and, if so, how far back that structure was believed to reach, before it ever required divine guarantors to be named at all. The legal language that treats order as inherited rather than proclaimed finds a parallel in how the sky itself is recorded. When astronomical texts begin to associate celestial order with the Anunnaki, they do not read as moments of revelation. They read as moments of arrangement, where long-observed patterns are gathered, stabilized, and given formal structure. Early Sumerian astronomical material does not appear suddenly alongside divine attribution. Observations of the moons, phases, seasonal cycles, and stellar risings are embedded in administrative timekeeping, long before explicit divine framing becomes common. Calendars regulate labor, festivals, and agricultural tasks with practical precision. The sky is treated as a dependable system whose regularity can be relied upon without explanation. When divine references begin to appear more clearly, the language does not suggest that new knowledge has been imparted. Instead, it situates existing observations within a broader order. Lists of stars and constellations are organized, named, and grouped. The Anunnaki are associated with the maintenance of these groupings, not with the initial act of discovery. The texts imply custody over order rather than authorship of insight. Astronomical tablets from centers such as Nippur reflect this tendency. They present sequences of celestial events aligned with ritual and administrative needs. The moon governs months, the sun anchors seasons, and certain stars mark transitions. These relationships are treated as stable. The role of divine authority is to guarantee their reliability, not to narrate their origin. The structure of the texts reinforces this impression. Astronomical lists resemble inventories more than teachings. They enumerate, categorize, and align phenomena without commentary. When divine names are present, they function as headings or reference points rather than as speakers. The Anunnaki do not instruct. They preside. The sky is already known well enough to be systematized. Calendrical texts are especially revealing. Adjustments for intercalation, timing of festivals, and synchronization of lunar and solar cycles reflect long-term observation. These adjustments are technical responses to accumulated data. The attribution of oversight to divine collectives does not introduce new methods. It legitimizes the precision already achieved by scribal practice. The absence of explanatory myth within these texts mirrors the restraint seen elsewhere. There is no account of the Anunnaki teaching humans to read the heavens. Instead, Celestial order is treated as part of the inherited structure of the world. The divine role is to ensure that this order remains intelligible and consistent, safeguarding its continuity across generations. This framing suggests that astronomy was embedded in daily governance long before it was framed with an explicit divine hierarchy. Timekeeping regulated taxation, labor rotation, and ritual obligation. The sky mattered because it organized work. Divine association strengthens trust in the system rather than expanding its scope. The language also avoids singular authority. No individual deity claims ownership of celestial knowledge. The Anunnaki appear as a collective, reinforcing the idea that cosmic order is distributed and stable. This collective framing distances the texts from notions of revelation delivered by a single source. Knowledge is communal, accumulated, and preserved. What emerges is a picture of astronomy as memory work. Observations are gathered, refined, and transmitted. Divine oversight marks the system as reliable, not novel. The scribes present the heavens as already speaking through regularity, with the Anunnaki ensuring that this speech remains orderly and legible. If celestial knowledge attributed to the Anunnaki reflects formalization rather than instruction, then the unresolved question is whether the authority of the sky was ever thought to begin with divine naming at all, or whether the Anunnaki were invoked only once observation had become stable enough to be entrusted to memory. The ordered sky, treated as something stabilized rather than revealed, finds its counterpart in how numbers themselves are handled in the tablets. Mathematical language in Summa does not emerge as a moment of instruction attributed to divine beings. It appears instead as a system already in motion, one that is gradually aligned, normalized, and preserved as part of administrative memory. From the earliest numerical tablets, counting is practical. Tokens become impressions, impressions become signs, and quantities are recorded to manage grain, labor, and land. The sexagesimal structure does not announce itself as an invention. It operates quietly, embedded in calculations long before divine frameworks are made explicit. The tablets assume familiarity. They record results, not methods. When references to divine authority, including the Anunnaki, begin to appear alongside numerical systems, they do not introduce new arithmetic principles. Measures of capacity, weight, and length remain consistent. What changes is the emphasis on standardization. The texts increasingly stress correct measure, proper equivalence, and sanctioned units. Mathematics is treated as something that must be kept aligned rather than discovered. Metrological lists provide clear evidence. These tablets lay out conversions between units with careful precision. They do not explain why these relationships exist. They assert them. The structure implies inheritance. A system received intact enough to require maintenance, rather than creation. The Anunnaki, when implicitly associated, function as guarantors of correctness, not as teachers of technique. In administrative centers such as Ur and Nippur, numerical tablets are found in contexts tied to storage and redistribution. Calculations govern rations, wages, and temple income. Errors matter because they disrupt balance. Divine oversight is implied in the insistence on exactness. Numbers are not neutral. They carry responsibility. The language of these tablets reinforces continuity. Phrases indicating correct measure or established count appear more frequently than terms suggesting innovation. The system is portrayed as already authoritative. To calculate incorrectly is not merely a mistake. It is a deviation from order. Anunnaki's presence in the broader textual environment frames mathematics as part of a cosmic balance that must be upheld. Even advanced problem texts, which demonstrate sophisticated manipulation of area and volume, avoid attribution. They do not claim divine inspiration. They present solutions as exercises within an accepted framework. The absence of origin stories suggests that mathematical knowledge was understood as accumulated craft, refined through practice and preserved through instruction. This preservation aligns with a broader pattern seen across Sumerian records. Knowledge is treated as something passed down, stabilized through repetition. Divine association strengthens legitimacy without altering content. The sexagesimal system does not change because the Anunnaki appear. It becomes more carefully guarded. Such treatment implies confidence in the system's antiquity. The scribes behave as custodians rather than innovators. Their role is to ensure that measures remain consistent across time and space. The Anunnaki serve as silent anchors, marking the system as part of an inherited order that extends beyond individual cities or generations. If mathematics in Sumer is framed as inheritance rather than revelation, then the quiet question that follows is whether numerical order was ever thought to belong to human ingenuity alone, or whether it was always understood as something older or something that required divine guarantos. Only once it had to be preserved rather than discovered. The accumulation of administrative, legal, numerical, and astronomical order leaves behind a tension that the tablets themselves do not resolve. Astronomical authority is assumed, yet the records rarely pause to explain why this order exists at all. It is within this gap that myth begins to take on a different function, not as foundation, but as retrospective explanation. Anunnaki-centered narratives do not appear to accompany the earliest operation of Sumerian institutions. They emerge later, layered over systems that are already mature. By the time extended mythological compositions circulate, the world they describe is one that scribes already know how to manage. The myths do not teach how to measure land, assign labor, regulate kingship, or mark time. They account for these realities after the fact. The structure of the myths reflects this timing. Rather than introducing unfamiliar institutions, they narrate the origins of temples, offices, and cosmic divisions that are already present in the documentary record. The Anunnaki are depicted organizing the world, assigning domains, fixing destinies. Yet these acts mirror the administrative processes visible in much earlier tablets. Myth recasts bureaucracy as cosmology. This suggests a narrative inversion. Instead of institutions growing out of myth, myth grows around institutions. The scribes do not invent new systems through storytelling. They use storytelling to stabilize meaning around systems whose origins have receded into the past. The Anunnaki become explanatory figures, not instructional ones. The language of myth reinforces this role. It is expansive, symbolic, and retrospective. Where administrative texts are concise and operational, myths are concerned with beginnings. They ask questions that daily records avoid. Who assigned roles? Who fixed boundaries? Who established order? The answer is not empirical. It is narrative. The Anunnaki fill the explanatory space left open by centuries of inherited practice. Importantly, these myths do not contradict the administrative worldview. De hecho, Italiano. Hierarchies among the Anunnaki resemble institutional hierarchies on Earth. Councils of gods reflect councils of elders and officials. Decisions are deliberated, roles distributed, responsibilities fixed. Myth amplifies familiar structures, projecting them backward into a primordial register. This backward projection implies that the scribes were not inventing belief so much as reconciling memory. The systems they maintained were old enough that their human origins were no longer visible. Myth provided a language for antiquity. By attributing order to the Anunnaki, the scribes placed its beginnings beyond dispute, safely out of reach of historical uncertainty. The timing of these narratives supports this view. Extended mythological texts appear once writing has already secured continuity. Only when systems are stable enough to be remembered does the need for origin stories arise. Myth becomes a way to explain why preservation matters, why deviation is dangerous, and why order carries weight beyond immediate utility. The Anunnaki's role within myth is therefore consistent with their role elsewhere. They do not introduce novelty, they guarantee permanence. In myth, as in law or mathematics, they stand at the far end of legitimacy. Their actions explain why the world must remain as it is recorded, not how it was first constructed in practical terms. This layering also explains why myths can vary without destabilizing the system they reference. Different compositions emphasize different divine roles, yet the underlying institutions remain unchanged. The narrative is flexible because its purpose is interpretive, not operational. Myth absorbs uncertainty, so administration does not have to. Seen this way, Anunnaki-centered mythology functions less as sacred history and more as historical philosophy. It reflects an attempt to think backward from an inherited world toward an origin that can no longer be documented. The gods occupy the space where memory ends. If myth emerges as a retrospective explanation rather than a foundational blueprint, then the unresolved question is not whether the Anunnaki created Sumerian order, but why the need to explain that order arose only after it had already been lived, measured, and recorded for generations. The retrospective turn of myth toward origins leaves one event standing apart. Not because it is explained too clearly, but because it marks a break the records themselves seem to recognize. The flood does not appear in the administrative material as an ending of civilization. It appears as a boundary, a line across which documentation hesitates and then resumes. Archaeological layers across southern Mesopotamia reveal episodes of flooding that interrupt settlement deposits at sites such as Shurapak and your flood strata sit between occupational levels, sealing earlier material beneath alluvial deposits. These layers do not erase the city above them. Rebuilding occurs, often on the same footprint, with similar spatial organization. The interruption is real, but it is not terminal. What is striking is how this physical interruption corresponds to shifts in record keeping rather than to the disappearance of institutional logic. After flood layers, tablets reappear with renewed emphasis on order, lists, accounts, and standardized formulas. The content feels familiar, yet the framing is more deliberate. The records behave as though continuity must now be asserted rather than assumed. Textual traditions later refer to a division between pre-flood and post-flood eras, especially in king lists. Yet Ivenere, the language, does not describe a reinvention of kingship. It describes a transfer. Kingship is said to have descended again, implying that it existed before, was interrupted, and then restored. The flood functions as a hinge, not a void. Administrative archaeology supports this reading. There is no evidence of a complete loss of metrological systems, calendrical logic, or bureaucratic structure after flood events. Measurements remain sexagesimal. Administrative categories persist. Temple estates reassert control. What changes is the care with which continuity is recorded. The scribes appear more conscious of rupture. This suggests that catastrophe was experienced as a disruption of memory rather than of knowledge. Floodwaters damage archives, displace populations, and interrupt transmission. When writing resumes, it does so with heightened attention to preservation. The flood becomes an administrative problem. How to re-anchor order. After records have been broken, the Anunnaki's role in later flood narratives aligns with this administrative concern. They are portrayed as adjudicators of fate and restorers of order, not as destroyers for their own sake. Their presence frames the flood as a managed boundary within a larger continuity. Destruction occurs, but within limits. Order returns because it is treated as recoverable. This framing also explains why flood stories coexist with uninterrupted practical systems. The mythic flood accounts do not introduce new administrative logic. They provide a narrative for why records restart, why reigns are renumbered, why memory is segmented. The flood explains the gap without challenging the legitimacy of what follows. From an archaeological perspective, the flood layers are reminders of vulnerability rather than annihilation. They show how closely Sumerian civilization was tied to its environment, and how quickly disruption could occur. Yet the rapid resumption of building and record-keeping implies resilience grounded in inherited structures rather than improvisation. The post-flood emphasis on order can thus be read as an archival response to catastrophe. The scribes are aware that continuity can be broken. Their work becomes an act of repair. The Anunnaki, positioned as guarantors of restored balance, belong to this reparative logic. They sanction renewal without implying novelty. Shantiswai, the flood marks the moment when preservation becomes conscious. Before it, systems operate. After it, systems are guarded. The boundary is not between ignorance and knowledge, but between unbroken memory and memory that knows it can fail. If the flood is best understood as an administrative boundary rather than a civilizational reset, then the quiet question that follows is how much of what the scribes later attributed to divine intervention was shaped by the simple human experience of having lost records once and fearing that they might be lost again. The flood boundary sharpens attention not toward what vanished, but toward what endured. When the record resumes, it does not read like a beginning. It reads like a careful continuation, aware of rupture yet anchored to familiar forms. The scribes write as though something essential has survived, even if its material traces had been interrupted. Post-flood tablets reintroduce institutions with recognizable outlines. Temples reclaim estates. Offices reappear with similar titles, and administrative categories resume their work. Grain is still counted, labor still assigned, measures still enforced. The vocabulary of management shows remarkable persistence. Where change occurs, it is often cosmetic or clarifying, not structural. Terms are adjusted, spellings standardized, but the underlying logic remains intact. Kingship language follows the same pattern. Royal authority is reasserted, yet not redefined. The king rules, but as custodian rather than originator. Titles echo earlier formulations, and responsibilities align with established expectations. The flood does not produce a new theory of rule. It intensifies the need to document alignment with inherited order. Continuity becomes explicit because it can no longer be assumed. Legal practice also resumes without reinvention. Contracts, oaths, and judgments employ familiar formulas. The presence of divine guarantors, including the Anunnaki, becomes more consistently named. But their role does not expand. They continue to witness, to sanction, to anchor accountability. The law itself is treated as older than the flood, something restored rather than calendrical and numerical systems show similar resilience. Time is still counted in familiar cycles. Measures remain sexagesimal. Adjustments appear, but they refine rather than replace. The scribes behave as though the system's correctness is beyond question. What requires attention is its preservation, not its justification. Precision becomes an ethical obligation, guarding against future disruption. Language offers some of the clearest evidence of continuity. Core administrative verbs persist across the divide. The grammar of obligation, allocation, and accountability remains stable. Where new phrases appear, they often emphasize restoration, reestablishment, or correct alignment. The flood does not change how the world works. It changes how carefully that working is recorded. What does change is the explicitness of memory. Post-flood texts show greater concern for lineage, succession, and archival stability. King lists segment time more clearly. Colophons become more deliberate. The scribes appear aware that records can be lost, that order can be interrupted. Writing becomes not just documentation, but defense against forgetting. Within this context, the increased visibility of the Anunnaki takes on a particular character. Their arrival and clearer textual focus does not coincide with new institutions or practices. It coincides with a heightened effort to preserve what already exists. Divine authority becomes more explicit as a stabilizing reference, a way to bind continuity across a remembered break. This suggests that the Anunnaki are drawn closer into the record not at the moment of creation, but at the moment of vulnerability. Their role aligns with preservation rather than innovation. They mark the enduring legitimacy of systems that have survived catastrophe, not the inauguration of those systems. Archaeology supports this reading. Settlement patterns reassert themselves. Urban layouts echo earlier plans. Production resumes along familiar lines. The material culture does not display a sharp stylistic rupture that would signal wholesale reinvention. Instead, it shows repair, adaptation, and continuation. The flood, then, does not divide ignorance from knowledge. It divides unself-conscious continuity from continuity that knows it can be broken. What persists is the structure of civilization itself. What changes is the awareness of its fragility. Writing responds by tightening its grip on memory. If divine figures become more prominent in the post-flood record as guarantors of order, the question that quietly follows is whether their arrival in clearer focus reflects a new presence in the world, or a new need to safeguard what the world had already been, now that it had once nearly been lost. The heightened awareness of continuity after the flood finds its most concrete expression in the archives themselves. Temple and palace collections do not present as laboratories of invention. They present as carefully layered memory systems, built to hold, retrieve, and reaffirm what is already known to be essential. Archaeological recovery from archive rooms in cities such as Nippur and Ur reveals accumulations rather than sequences. Tablets are stored in groups, sometimes reordered, sometimes recopied, but rarely discarded entirely. Older records remain present even as new ones are added. The archive grows by sediment, not by replacement. The internal logic of these archives reinforces this impression. Administrative tablets, legal decisions, lexical lists, and ritual texts coexist within the same institutional spaces. Their proximity suggests that knowledge was not compartmentalized by genre but integrated by purpose. The archive functions as a collective memory bank, preserving the operational grammar of society rather than promoting novelty. Copying practices are especially revealing. Scribes repeatedly reproduce older texts, sometimes centuries after their initial composition. Errors are corrected, spellings updated, but the structure is preserved. This labor-intensive process implies value placed on fidelity. Innovation would be easier. Preservation requires discipline. The archive thus becomes an instrument for stabilizing meaning across time. In this context, the Anunnaki appear less as active agents and more as interpretive anchors. Later texts that reference them often do so in relation to archival authority. Oaths sworn before the divine order, records kept under divine sanction, and institutions described as belonging to the gods all situate the archive within a larger framework of legitimacy. The Anunnaki do not introduce new content into the archive. They frame why the archive matters. The physical layout of archive spaces supports this role. Restricted access, controlled entry, and proximity to administrative offices indicate that archives were guarded environments. Memory was valuable, and its protection was institutionalized. Divine oversight, when implied, mirrors this concern. The gods are associated with custody, not creativity. Archival theory helps clarify this pattern. Systems designed for innovation prioritize circulation and experimentation. Systems designed for memory prioritize stability, redundancy, and continuity. Sumerian archives align strongly with the latter. The repetition of forms, the persistence of terminology, and the careful maintenance of precedents all point toward an inherited worldview being actively maintained. The flood boundary intensifies this function. After a known rupture in record keeping, archives take on added weight. They become safeguards against loss. The presence of the Anunnaki in later interpretive layers aligns with this defensive posture. Divine custodianship legitimizes the act of preservation, elevating it beyond mere bureaucracy. Importantly, the archive does not explain itself. It does not narrate why preservation is necessary. It enacts that necessity through practice. Tablets are kept because they must be kept. The Anunnaki's association with archives does not change how records are stored or copied. It changes how that practice is understood, as participation in an order larger than any single generation. This understanding also explains the coexistence of outdated material alongside current records. Obsolete measures, earlier legal forms, and superseded titles remain accessible. The archive values memory over efficiency. What matters is not whether a system is current, but whether its lineage is traceable. Shan, these why archives become the quiet center of Sumerian civilization. They hold the patterns that allow society to resume after disruption. Te Anunnaki, when invoked in relation to these patterns, appear as symbols of continuity rather than sources of instruction. They stand at the far edge of memory, where explanation fades and legitimacy begins. If archives were designed to preserve inherited order rather than generate new forms, and if the Anunnaki come to be associated with that preservation, then the unresolved question is whether divine custodianship reflects a belief about the gods themselves, or a human recognition that memory, once broken, requires authority beyond the living to endure. The recognition of archives as instruments of memory rather than engines of invention invites a wider glance beyond southern Mesopotamia. Without proposing contact or transmission, similar structural patterns appear in other early civilizations, where order precedes explicit divine arrival in the record, and where gods enter texts as guarantors rather than founders. In ancient Egypt, administrative practice is already well established before extended theological explanation becomes prominent. Early dynastic records focused on taxation, labor organization, and land management, with minimal mythic framing. Only later do cosmological narratives expand around these practices, presenting divine figures as sustainers of Mahat, the balance that governance is meant to uphold. As in Sumer, the gods do not teach administration. They explain why it must remain aligned. A comparable pattern can be observed in the Indus Valley. Urban planning, standardized brick ratios, and calibrated weights appear early, embedded in daily practice. Yet clear divine narratives are sparse in the surviving material. Order operates without overt mythic explanation. If divine authority existed, it left few explicit traces in text. The system functions first. Interpretation, if it existed, remains largely invisible. The absence itself suggests that the administration did not require narrative origin to operate. In early China, especially during the Shang period, ritual and governance intersect through divination rather than through creation myths tied to political order. Oracle bone inscriptions record questions, outcomes, and confirmations. They do not narrate the origins of kingship or law. Divine forces are consulted as arbiters, not as architects. Authority is stabilized through reference, not revelation. Across these cultures, a shared structural sequence emerges. Systems of measurement, governance, and record-keeping appear early and operate with confidence. Divine figures become prominent when explanation becomes necessary, often in response to scale, complexity, or disruption. Myth and theology grow around order rather than giving rise to it. This similarity does not require diffusion to be meaningful. It suggests that early complex societies faced comparable pressures. Administration needed legitimacy that extended beyond individual rulers. Memory needed anchoring beyond fragile human transmission. Divine frameworks offered durability, projecting authority backward and forward in time. In this light, the Anunnaki's emergence after order is not anomalous. It fits a broader human pattern in which the sacred is invoked to stabilize what already works. The gods become custodians of continuity, ensuring that inherited systems remain intact across generations and crises. The parallel also clarifies what these narratives are not. They are not technical manuals. They do not explain how to count, measure, or govern. They explain why those acts matter and why deviation carries consequence. Myth becomes a language of justification, not instruction. Seen comparatively, Sumer's trajectory appears less unique in content and more distinctive in documentation. Its tablets preserve the transition with unusual clarity. Where other cultures leave gaps, Sumer leaves sequences. The Anunnaki stand within those sequences as markers of interpretive shift rather than of institutional birth. If multiple civilizations independently place divine arrival after the establishment of order, the quiet implication is that human societies may first learn how to operate and only later ask why their operations should endure. The unresolved question, then, is whether this pattern reflects a shared psychological response to complexity, or whether it reveals something deeper about how memory itself seeks authority once practice alone is no longer enough. The accumulated record now presses toward a single tension that the tablets never resolve directly. Across administration, law, architecture, astronomy, mathematics, myth, catastrophe, and archival practice, the same posture repeats. Systems are assumed before they are explained. Authority is maintained before it is justified. The language of the texts consistently looks backward, even when describing the present. When Sumerian scribes record their world, they do not frame it as newly assembled. Institutions appear already functional. Measures are already calibrated. Time is already divided. Kingship already exists as an office with limits and obligations. Even when divine figures enter the written focus, they do not introduce these structures. They preside over them. The records imply reception rather than creation. This is not a conclusion imposed from outside. It is a pattern visible in how the texts behave. Innovation, when it occurs, is incremental and rarely celebrated. Adjustments are absorbed quietly into existing frameworks. What receives emphasis is correct alignment with what is already established. The scribes write as custodians, not as founders. The Anunnaki occupy a crucial position in this posture. Their increasing visibility does not coincide with new technologies, new political forms, or new economic systems. It coincides with moments when preservation becomes conscious. After disruption, after expansion, after complexity deepens, divine authority is named more clearly. The Anunnaki stabilize rather than initiate. They regulate rather than invent. Kingship illustrates this most clearly. The king is never described as the source of order. He is measured against it. His legitimacy depends on stewardship, maintenance, and accountability. Even divine sanction does not elevate him beyond the system he serves. Kingship is treated as older than any king, and divine oversight reinforces that antiquity rather than replacing it with novelty. Law follows the same logic. Legal formulas assume precedent. Oaths bind parties to what already stands. Divine witnesses guaranteed endurance, not creativity. The Anunnaki do not legislate within the texts. They ensure that law, once articulated, remains binding across time and circumstance. Astronomy and mathematics deepen the pattern. Celestial cycles and numerical systems are treated as stable realities that must be maintained accurately. Divine association does not expand knowledge. It legitimizes its preservation. The heavens are already ordered. Numbers already work. What matters is fidelity, not discovery. Architecture and archives give this posture material form. Temples function as administrative centers because order must be housed somewhere. Archives grow by accumulation, not replacement. Old texts remain relevant because continuity matters more than efficiency. Memory is layered, not overwritten. Divine custodianship aligns naturally with this architectural and archival logic. Myth enters last, not first. It does not generate institutions. It explains them. It projects order backward into a time beyond documentation, filling the gap where memory fails. The Anunnaki become narrative figures precisely because systems have become too old to explain empirically. Myth provides antiquity, not instruction. The flood sharpens the distinction. After records are interrupted, the response is not reinvention, but restoration. Systems resume in recognizable form. What changes is the urgency of preservation. Writing becomes defensive. Divine guarantors become more explicit. The Anunnaki stand at the edge of remembered loss, anchoring continuity against the threat of forgetting. Taken together, these strands suggest that Sumerian civilization, as it presents itself in its own records, is not narrated as an act of creation. It is narrated as an inheritance. The scribes do not ask how the world was made. They ask how it is to be kept in order. Their work is maintenance, regulation, and repair. This does not mean that nothing new ever occurred. It means that novelty was absorbed into a framework that valued continuity above originality. Even change had to be justified as restoration of proper balance. The language of invention is largely absent because invention is not the point. Stability is. The Anunnaki, within this worldview, are not architects arriving to build civilization. They are custodians. Named one civilization must be consciously preserved. Their authority is invoked when memory requires reinforcement. They stand where explanation gives way to legitimacy. What remains unresolved is whether this posture reflects historical reality or scribal philosophy. Did Sumerian society truly inherit its structures from an unrecorded past? Or did the need for stability simply encourage the presentation of all systems as ancient and received? The tablets do not answer this. They only show how the scribes chose to remember, and so the final tension remains quietly in place. If civilization in Sumer is framed not as invention but as inheritance, then the deeper question is not who created these systems but why those who maintained them found it necessary to insist that they had always already been there. The accumulated weight of continuity brings the inquiry to its final boundary, not where the texts speak most clearly, but where they consistently fall silent. After tracing administration, law, mathematics, architecture, myth, and catastrophe, one absence remains unchanged. The tablets never describe the arrival itself. There is no record of the Anunnaki entering the world. No tablet pauses to mark a moment of appearance. No administrative note signals a transition from absence to presence. No narrative anchors their role to a dated event. Their authority is assumed, their position integrated, their relevance structural. The silence is not accidental. It is systematic. This refusal to describe arrival stands in contrast to how other disruptions are treated. Floods are remembered. Dynasties are renewed. Reigns are counted. Loss is implied. Restorations named. Even when explanation is minimal, transition is acknowledged. The absence of any comparable treatment for the Anunnaki suggests that arrival was not a category the scribes found useful to record. From a documentary perspective, this matters. Sumerian writing excels at marking thresholds when those thresholds affect administration. A new ruler, a destroyed archive, a restored temple all are noted because they alter how order must be managed. The Anunnaki do not alter procedure. Their presence requires no new accounting method, no revised calendar, no altered measure. There is nothing operational to record. This implies that the scribes did not experience divine authority as an interruption. The Anunnaki do not break continuity, they reinforce it. Arrival narratives belong to things that change how the world works. What does not change does not require narration. The silence also reflects priority. Sumerian texts are not concerned with origins for their own sake. They are concerned with stability. Where explanation does not serve preservation, it is unnecessary. The scribes write to ensure that systems endure, not to satisfy curiosity about beginnings. The question of arrival may simply have been irrelevant to their task. Even myth respects this boundary. While later narratives describe the ordering of the world, they rarely linger on how divine authority first appeared. The Anunnaki are present when order is distributed, not when they themselves emerge. Myth fills gaps in memory, but it does not invent moments the archive does not require. The silence remains intact, even in storytelling. This restraint suggests an epistemology grounded in function. Knowledge is valued insofar as it supports continuity. What cannot be verified through operation is not emphasized. The arrival of the Anunnaki, if conceived as a discrete event, would belong to a time beyond administrative reach. It would not assist in managing land, labor, or law. The tablets therefore leave it untouched. The gaps also caution modern interpretation. Absence does not necessarily imply secrecy or loss. It can imply irrelevance within the scribal worldview. To insist on arrival narratives where none exists risks projecting modern expectations onto ancient priorities. The scribes did not write to answer all questions, only the ones that mattered for preservation. Shantis, why the Anunnaki occupy a paradoxical position. They are everywhere in implication, and nowhere in origin. They sanction systems, witness oaths, anchor legitimacy, and explain antiquity, yet they never enter the stage. Their authority is timeless within the record, unbound to a beginning because beginnings are not what the tablets are designed to hold. The silence thus becomes its own form of evidence. It suggests that Sumerian civilization understood itself not as something that started, but as something that continued. Arrival would imply a before and after. The texts resist that division. They prefer inheritance to inception, maintenance to emergence. What the tablets refuse to say, then, may be as revealing as what they record. They tell us what mattered to those who wrote them. Order, continuity, and the careful transmission of a world already in motion. They do not tell us where that world began. And so the inquiry closes not with an answer, but with the boundary the scribes themselves maintained. If the arrival of the Anunnaki is never described because it lay outside the concerns of record-keeping, the inevitable question that remains is whether this silence reflects ignorance of origins or a deliberate decision that origins, once order exists, no longer need to be remembered at all.